Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope you are all doing very well today. If you don't mind, I'd like to take this opportunity, if I may, to begin a discussion with you, my dear friends, with respect to a very interesting and special and peculiar work of art. That work is called Out-One, NOLI ME TANGERE. This is Out-One, NOLI ME TANGERE. This is credited as being written by Jacques Rivette and Suzanne Schiffmann, directed by Jacques Rivette, although I should point out that Suzanne Schiffmann is oftentimes credited as the co-director of the work. In fact, I think the end credits of the each episode credits Suzanne Schiffmann as being co-réalisation, with Jacques Rivette being credited as mise en scène. The Arrow Academy book credits the writing of Out-One as being by Jacques Rivette and Suzanne Schiffmann, and directed by Jacques Rivette. So that's just for your information based on the Arrow Academy book, which I have right here. That came with the set. And produced by Stefan Chaigajev. So what I would like to do is I would like to focus our discussion of this work, Out-One, NOLI ME TANGERE, per episode. So as you know, there are 8 distinct episodes of this work that comprises Out-One, NOLI ME TANGERE. So this video, this first video, this inaugural video as it were, will talk about the first episode, episode 1, premier episode, which is called De Lili à Thomas. So please, if you are interested, please join me in this discussion. What I will do is I will focus my discussion on the specifics of this first episode only. So I won't be going into details about any subsequent episodes. So the discussion will focus on this episode primarily. So if you are interested, and I will do a similar kind of framing of discussion as we progress from episode to episode with each video. In other words, I will focus each video on that episode, and I won't go into spoilers into future subsequent episodes. So one possibility, if you're interested, is you can watch Out-One, NOLI ME TANGERE as you watch these videos. In other words, if you finish episode 1, you can stop watching Out-One and you can come to this video if you so choose. So I won't necessarily be spoiling anything that comes in later episodes, just focusing primarily on this first episode. But I will try to make some general ties, or maybe, to put it a better way, I'll try to set some very vague, ambiguous, foundational work for the possibility of linkages that one might be able to make with later episodes. But I won't go into too much detail lest I spoil it for you. But I do think it is important to have a general discussion, to a certain degree anyway, about how certain things that come up in this first episode might appear again, or might be linked to certain things that will appear in later episodes. But be that as it may, I will be vague as possible, and I will avoid talking about spoilers of any future episodes. That being said, of course, I will be talking about specifics of episode 1. So if you haven't seen episode 1 of Out-One, NOLI ME TANGERE, please stop this video now and please watch Out One NOLI ME TANGERE and episode 1, and then when you finished watching it, you can come back and this video will still be here. And at that time, it will be my pleasure to have a discussion with you and to hear your thoughts and comments about episode 1, De Lili Atoma, the title of premiere episode of Out One NOLI ME TANGERE. So you're still here, which means I can assume that you have seen the first episode of Out One NOLI ME TANGERE. So I should take a quick moment here before I continue to talk to you about, just generally about this work and about my experience with Jacques Rivette in general, and just my general take about this before we dive in specifically into this episode. So I should say from the outset that I am not claiming myself to be any kind of expert on Jacques Rivette or the works of Jacques Rivette. I have not seen the quote-unquote original version of Out One NOLI ME TANGERE. I understand that this version that has now been released by Arrow Academy and maybe by other labels and is now fairly accessible. I understand that this was a version that, well, let me just take a step back. Out One NOLI ME TANGERE was known as Out One when it was first released or first made around 1970, 1971. This is according to information that we can find online, but very generally also nicely presented in this booklet. And the original intention, according to the book here, was that it would be made, it would be this long thing that would be planned to be shown on French television. Well, to put it, to put it very generally, at the time, once it was made, it was apparent that French television would not be willing to show this for whatever reason. And so from there, Jacques Rivette and his team decided to take the material, which was nearly 13 hours of Out One, and then edit it down into a separate version, which is called Out One Spectre, which is a version which I will hopefully be talking about in a subsequent YouTube video. And then fast forward to around 1990, where I understand that Jacques Rivette decided to return to Out One and to revisit the material of the original nearly 13-hour work. And from there, there was work done, there was certain restorations to be had with certain aspects of the material. And also I understand that there was some little bit of re-editing or some edits that were made that made the work Out One as of 1990 more or less faithful to the original version as it first emerged in the early 1970s, but there were some differences made. But this version of Out One seems to be the version that is held out to be a reflection of this long, nearly 13-hour work that was, in a certain form anyway, first emerged on the scene back in 1971. Okay, so we're getting, I understand, an almost identical version, not quite identical, but almost identical version in 1990, and that is carried over into what we have here today. And I understand also that the subtitle, NOLI ME TANGERE, was affixed to the work Out One during this time of 1990. So my understanding is that the subtitle NOLI ME TANGERE was not a part of the title Out One when it was first released in 1971, although I could be mistaken about that. I understand that that title came subsequent. Be that as it may, it is now understood that the nearly 13-hour, 8-episode work that is Out One NOLI ME TANGERE, this is the version that was, let's say, restored or re-prepared or re-unearthed, as it were, and was prepared for posterity's sake in 1990, and this was carried through to the present day, which is what we have here. I should say also that we have the phrase "NOLI ME TANGERE," which is translated, I think, or can be translated into English as, don't touch me, don't come close to me, something like that. So I'm sure those of you who are Latin scholars can provide a more accurate pronunciation. But I think the point here is that we have already an interesting play on titles here. Out one noli me tangere. So out as opposed to in. One, which has this kind of signifier or significance with respect to some kind of numbers. And as we will get into, I think the issue of numbers becomes a very significant issue, even from the get-go in the premiere episode of Out One Noli Me Tangere. And then also we have this rather mysterious kind of phrase, "Noli me tangere," so don't touch me, don't come near me. I think we can get a sense that perhaps this might be suggestive of this kind of interconnection or connectivity, or perhaps a lack of connectivity, the impenetrability of one human being regarding another, or the inability of understanding the other, the idea of being on the outside, if you will. I think this kind of understanding or theme can be applied quite effectively to many key components of this work, Out One Noli Me Tangere, even from the first episode, which is what I will try to suggest to you as we go on with this conversation. Okay, so with that in mind, let us dive in to this episode. This is entitled De Lili à Thomas, which means from Lily to Thomas, or Thomas. And we're also given a title card of April 13th, 1970. So we were given a certain time, and we are given a title which seems to be suggesting from one character to another, from Lily to Thomas. I think we can start our discussion by focusing in on what this episode seems to be focusing on in terms of the character clusters, the groupings that are already beginning to form, even from this initial stage. I can count four main components that are presented here in the first episode of Out One Noli Me Tangere. So the first component, we have one of the theater troupes, which is a group of actors that seems to be rehearsing a play, which we will later understand to be Seven Against Thebes, the Aeschylus play. This is the first grouping that we see at the very outset, the opening of the work. When we see them stretched out with their legs and kind of buttocks thrust in the air, and then they are curling their bodies down, and then they are stretching, and they go up and they do their little circular sort of dance routine as a kind of warm-up, and it's set to a kind of bongo drum musical theme, which will become significant as the episodes progress, as you will see. And we see a kind of an irreverence and a liveliness to them. We see, what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 characters that are present in this space. And we see 3 female characters and 2 male characters. So the 2 male characters are the one with the brown hair, the short brown hair, who is Quentin, Quentin. And the other is, he's got a white sort of blouse shirt, and he's got slightly long blondish hair, and he's a little bit tall. And he is known as, he's known as a number of names. He is known as, he is known as Nicolas, or Theo, or Papa, or Arsene. And it depends on who is calling him, and I'll get to that in a second. And then we have the 3 female characters that emerge. So the first one is in the very back, who is Elaine, and we will come to know her later in the episode as being the one who can play the flute, and she has a certain musical background. She is the one who we will see later leading the chorus of this group as we see them practicing their voice training and going up and down with their guttural voices and trying to create a kind of chorus or choral thing, whether it be part of the performance itself that is being planned or whether it be a kind of acting exercise. It's not entirely clear, but I think it might be the former rather than the latter. But in fact, Elaine is, again, one of the characters that we see immediately. And she plays the flute. Okay. The next character is the one that is in the foreground, which is on the left part of the screen, and she has sort of curly brown hair with a turquoise color bandana, and she is Marie. And it's very interesting to see Marie as she progresses. Just take a look at her if you plan to watch the episode again. Take a look at her as she's doing her exercises. She seems, while she's more or less going along with the exercise in terms of the timing, she seems a little bit off with the rest of the crew, right? She seems to get up a little bit earlier than the rest of them. She seems to be moving her head in a way that's not in unison with the rest of them when they are doing the circular thing and they stop and they do their head moves and then they turn. You notice that she's turning her head on a different timing. So it's probably the fact that her timing is a little bit off. And that might be a little bit suggestive of the type of character that she is. But maybe that will become more clear as we get into her character as the episodes progress. But anyway, this is Marie. And then we have the character with a sort of purple colored lace bow in her hair, and she has reddish hair, and she has a kind of striped blouse on her. And this is Lili. And this is, we can assume to be the Lili in the title of the episode, De Lili à Thomas. She seems to have a certain leadership role over this group, which is very interesting. So we can assume that she is probably the director of this troupe, or she is the director of this particular production, Seven Against Thebes. We can tell because from the outset she is directing the group immediately, right? There's that moment after they've done their exercises when Quentin and Arsene, Theo, Papa, Nicolas, rather playfully do a little joust in the which is sort of a playful sort of out of the blue spur of the moment type of just playful moment where they reenact the messenger coming to meet Eteocles. Dites-moi, Monsieur Eteocles, right? And they have a very irreverent moment, and Marie gets into it as well, calling out the scene. And it's great because Lili sees this, right? And she says, oh, that's great. Let's do this again. I want to practice this. And it goes into the art of trying to recapture a moment of improvisation that was ephemeral, that came and went just like that. And then we get into the mechanics of their acting in terms of speaking quickly and speaking slowly, trying to get at the right height, switching out Quentin in favor of Marie in terms of the messenger role in that particular moment of the play. And we see this kind of, not only we see the deep-rooted mechanics of the acting and this kind of acting method on display immediately, which is tying in very beautifully to the immediate introductory scene that we saw immediately before with respect to the warm-up exercises, as it were, which seems to be an indication of an acting method. But also we see a kind of absurdity that comes into it immediately, which we saw immediately at the outset as well. It seems, on the other hand, to be quite absurd, and the fact that they are trying to recapture a moment that is no longer there is really, I think, a wonderful metaphor, because it seems to be suggesting that from the very beginning there seems to be a chase after something that is unattainable, or it's some kind of quest to obtain something that cannot be captured again, as it were, or they're trying their best to do something like that. And I think from those first 5 minutes or so already we get a really bold statement and something that will linger and will have great repercussions as we go through the rest of the work, as hopefully we will see, not only as this episode plays itself out, but also as the further episodes of Out One NOLI ME TANGERE plays themselves out as well. I should say, let me just stop here, and I should say that I think also, and we'll get into this when we get into the other acting troupe that is part of this episode here, but I think we can see also a bit of sort of comic absurdity here. I am not in any way an actor, and I don't have any training in terms of the acting method. So I am very much a novice when it comes to the specifics of acting methods. I can assume that what we see at the very outset are part of these acting methods that are being employed by this group of actors here, but that is led by Lili. But to me, on the one hand, I can sort of get into it, but on the other hand, I can see the absurdity, and it seems to me to be a little bit impenetrable and almost somewhat silly to me on certain levels. It's sometimes very difficult for me to fully grasp the nature of this. And I think also that's part of the point too. Not only does this add a sense of a kind of comedy to the proceedings, it's not a deadly serious work, but the tone already seems to suggest a kind of almost light-hearted affair, at least to a certain degree. Also, there is a sense that what they are doing is already something that I don't think I would ever fully be able to understand or penetrate. And I think that is also very important to keep in mind as we go through the rest of these episodes of Out One NOLI ME TANGERE, and in particular this group. What characters will we see in Out One that seem to represent a sort of a mysterious group, or a group that might seem to be somewhat impenetrable in terms of their inner workings? What other characters might we see to be more sympathetic to our position, namely characters that we might see as being on a similar quest of trying to penetrate the otherwise impenetrable? I think that kind of maybe drawn out metaphor can be applied, at least in a general sense anyway, here. At least we can see the beginnings of that, and I believe we can carry that through as the series progresses. But let's just keep that in mind. So anyway, also let's keep in mind the characters here. Oh, I should say also something that's very interesting, which I will hopefully get to later. Please remember that the male character who we assume is playing Eteocles in the play, he is the sort of taller man with a slightly long blondish hair. He's wearing like a white shirt during the proceedings here. It's very interesting. He is referred to by Marie as Arsene. He is also referred to by Quentin as Papa. Elaine calls him Theo, and I believe it is Lili who calls him Nicolas. So depending on which character is addressing him, he is being addressed by different names, which is very interesting. But the first time we hear his name being addressed, it's by Marie, who calls him Arsene. So you'll notice, therefore, that in the credits and also in the book, he is referred to as Nicolas, Theo, Papa, and Arsene. It's the same character, at least I think so. Although that also gets into this interesting idea of, well, we're talking about actors, and we see these acting troupes seemingly engaged in some kind of rehearsal. So already we're getting a sense of a kind of play within a play kind of scheme. And also actors or people or characters that seem to have maybe one name at one instant and another name at another instant, and they seem to have maybe more than one name, not only in terms of their acting facade and their real life character, but also in the real world, so to speak. They seem to have name changes or identity changes, as it were. And this probably is a very interesting precursor to that, which hopefully we might see carry itself out to even more levels of complexity as the episodes progress. But anyway, let's just keep that in mind as it might be something that is of significance later on. Okay, so that's one group that we deal with. The next group that we deal with is the other acting troupe. And this is the acting troupe that is separate from the first acting troupe. Now, we will later learn that this is the acting troupe that seems to be led by Thomas. Now, I went through this episode quite a lot, and I don't think that Thomas is ever referred to directly by name exactly, although we do know that Thomas is the leader here because the actor Michael Lonsdale is credited at the end credits, and Michael Lonsdale is very famous as an actor, and he is credited as being Thomas. So that's how I know that he is Thomas. And in fact, this is another signal immediately, because, oh, this must be the same Thomas that we saw at the outset with the title, De Lili à Thomas. So already we can sense some kind of connection. What, I'm not sure yet, but there might be some kind of connection between Lili, who was the so-called maybe leader or the head of the earlier acting troupe, Seven Against Thebes, and now Thomas, the Michael Lonsdale character. And we understand that they are, well, rehearsing perhaps, or trying to rehearse some kind of representation of the Aeschylus play Prometheus Bound. Okay, so who are these characters? Let's also try to keep this in mind as best as we can. I know it's a lot, but let's try to keep this in mind. So we have Thomas, who is the Michael Lonsdale character, and then we have another male character here who has he's slightly younger perhaps, he has a beard, and he is credited in the end credits as being Achille. So let's remember, so Thomas and Achille are the two men in this second acting group. Then we have Beatrice. Now, Beatrice is the woman with the long brown hair, and she has a kind of prominent role in the proceedings that we see playing themselves out in this episode 1 with respect to what the actors are doing. And then there is Bergamotte. Now, Bergamotte is the other actress who has dark hair, but it's short and curly, and she's wearing this black shirt, long sleeve shirt and pants. So that's Bergamotte. So let's remember Beatrice and Bergamotte. And then there is Rose, who is the woman with the long, straight, sort of blonde or blondish hair. And finally, we have Faune, who is the red-haired actress part of the troupe. So we have these four women, Beatrice, Bergamotte, Rose, and Faune. And then we have the two men in the troupe, who are Thomas and Achille. So we have these group of 6 actors. And they are in a different theater. They don't seem to be related to the earlier acting troupe. And they are performing what we understand to be Prometheus Bound. But let's talk about their performance. Their performance seems to be quite interesting. Now, they are seemingly in the throes of some kind of rehearsal work or warm-up work or something. It's not quite clear, but they do what is referred to later on as mirror work, and then they get into some kind of level, or they reach some level of their subconscious perhaps, where they seem to be acting out in a very primal way, acting with gestures and movements rather than words, articulating themselves with feelings and instincts. And this plays itself out in a very long bravura performance component of the film, rather in the episode, I should say. We see them at first maybe biting each other or writhing around on the floor and trying to interact with each other in an almost, they are acting almost like animals or infants, or almost on a primate level. They are acting like animals that are just struggling at the very essence of their consciousnesses, right? So, which is a very interesting thing, and they are acting themselves out in a very physical manner. Sometimes they are acting against each other. Sometimes they're sort of maybe slightly aggressive towards each other. Maybe there are some sexual overtones that are played out, but there's a lot of moaning, a lot of writhing, a lot of groaning going on. But I would suggest to you that this seems to be a kind of representation. Let's take it out of the context of the play Prometheus Bound for a minute, and let's just look at it in terms of what it could represent. Because I think it's more than just, a bunch of actors like groaning and humping and writhing around on the floor for about, 20 minutes or so. I think it's much more than that. You can kind of tell that there is a kind of progression that is taking place with this. At least that's what I would suggest to you. We start at the very beginning with their sort of mirror exercises where they are paired 2, 2, and 2. It's Thomas and Beatrice, who's one pair, and then Achille and Rose, another pair, and Bergamotte and Faune as the third pair. And they are seen mirroring each other. In other words, they are paired and they're trying to essentially mimic the movements of the other in a very slow fashion. And their movements are very slow, and in particular Beatrice and Thomas, their movements are almost slow at the same pace as almost like Tai Chi, as it were. And it's very interesting. And it's even more interesting that we see this mirroring technique started off at the very outset with a reflection, right? The camera starts with a reflection of this studio or this workspace, and it goes right to the pairs, and they're engaged in their mirroring. And once they get into the mood, as it were, then they go on the ground and they reach into themselves and they try to find some kind of base feeling or emotion or thing to hang on to, and that's how they develop whatever it is they develop. And as I say, it becomes a very base primal thing, but gradually we can see a kind of progression. At the start it seems to be quite chaotic, with a lot of groaning and maybe this sort of scratching movement and maybe a bit of aggression. But then that seems to progress or evolve into a sort of maybe instinct of trying to be together, or of instinct of trying to attain some kind of union with each other, whether that be based on friendship or sexual impulse or something similar to that kind. And then we see a gradual progression where there is more sort of involvement among the group. They seem to be more in unison. Then there's a moment of progression where they are making noises that are in sync with each other. That seems almost choral. Then there is a development where they are becoming again engaged in a kind of primal scream sort of chaos, and their energies seem to be directed towards this red mannequin in the center, which I can assume is maybe a proper stand-in for the character of Prometheus in the context of the play Prometheus Bound. But I'll get to that connection between the troupe and Prometheus in a second. And then just carrying on with this group, then we see them engaged in sort of musical banter. They are carrying on a beat. One is playing like a recorder or some kind of wind instrument. So there is even a further evolution or progress from the very outset. They started out almost like animals with just acting on pure base instincts, but they're slowly, gradually growing, as it were, or evolving into becoming a little bit more articulate. And then we see sometimes some of the characters mouthing letters or maybe the occasional isolated word. And then in fact there's one moment where we see the bearded man, who is Achille, who is still in this play mode, and he says the line in a very staccato way, but he says the line, "Don't think that I am silent out of pride or stubbornness," right? And then the group plays with this, and then they continue to writhe on the floor and engage with this very intense moment But that is a line from Prometheus Bound, and I think it has a lot of significance that we can try to carry through with respect to another character that I'll talk about in a second. But my point is that I think that we can see this very intense thing that happens with this acting troupe as being much more than just an exercise in sort of artistic indulgence, as it were, or a very impenetrable or hard to understand acting method. I think it's that too, but I think it's also something else. It seems to be suggesting a kind of improv, like the chaos in improvisation. Later we will find out that in fact the characters or these actors were engaged in this very intense mode of improvisation, and they share their notes afterwards and what they were thinking, what they were feeling, and they were improvising and working off of each other's energies. And I think this is such a great thing to behold, because when we understand how Out One as a work was created, as a work of improvisation, then I think this episode with Thomas and his actors in Prometheus Bound, I think really is a great sort of microcosm of the kind of intensity that we can assume took place with the production of Out One. There is also this idea of a kind of animalistic nature to humanity that's on display, and also reaching in and trying to act on instinct. And I think when we think about this work of Out One, I think a lot of it has to do not necessarily with the intellectual, although it seems to have a sort of pseudo-intellectual aspect to it. But I would also argue that a great deal of it has to do with the instinctual, or the instinct. What do we think is going on based on our instincts of what we think we see? And this is true for the characters that we see in the work, but also this is, I think, true on the part of the viewer, at least for me anyway. So, and there is a kind of story that is going on with this particular part of the episode, with the whole groaning and writhing, right? Because if we then think about the work Prometheus Bound, I'm not an expert in Aeschylus. I don't know Prometheus Bound with great confidence or anything like that, but I do know that we have the character of Prometheus, and Prometheus is bound and tied, and I can assume, therefore, that the mannequin is some kind of stand-in for Prometheus, maybe a prop that's supposed to represent Prometheus. And throughout the play, we see various discussions or conversations to be had with certain sort of spirits or gods or godlike figures or entities that represent forces of nature or human spirit or that sort of thing. So on the one hand, I can see this representation by these actors to be some kind of maybe representation of the turmoil and the punishment that is to be imposed upon Prometheus. But also, it seems like because of Achille and the fact that he mouths one of the lines that I think is attributed to Prometheus in the play, right? Don't think that I am silent because out of pride or stubbornness, right? And so, because it's Achille who is one of these writhing characters, right? Because it's he who mouths these words, this group could also be seen in another way to be like a representation of the inner turmoil of Prometheus, right? In other words, this is maybe a representation of the inner workings of the character, which, if that's the case, I think it's a very interesting avant-garde way of presenting the work Prometheus Bound. Now, what we learn later in the characters or the actors' breakdown of what they were feeling, right? Because there's a scene afterwards where we see the group actually sit down, and we see Thomas and Achille sitting in chairs, and then we have the four female actors, Beatrice, or Bergamotte, Beatrice, Rose and Faune, in that order, sitting on the floor, and they're talking about what they were feeling as they were performing this. And we understand that during that discussion, which I think is very interesting, they were talking about how they were clinging on to certain aspects of what they were feeling at the moment. Bergamotte was talking about a cough that she was then developing as part of her character that she used, and that was part of her improvisational energy, if you will. Then Beatrice was talking about her arm and how there was a convulsion that she was feeling in her right arm and how she was trying to use that. And then Rose was talking about her foot. Maybe someone was biting her. And I think it was Achille, actually, who was seen biting her toes at the very outset. And then she was using that to feel like her character had her foot that was injured or amputated or something like that, and she was trying to use that as well. And then Faune was talking about a kind of hunger that she was feeling, right? So they were all thinking about or using something that was part of their base instincts, and they used that to develop something in an improvisational exercise. But what was very interesting about that episode, which that they were talking about how they felt like this time everything was rather quick and it was hard to get in to the moment, as it were, but they eventually did so. But I think most of the characters expressed difficulty with this. Also, the characters, if you recall, expressed difficulty with the fact that I think this was some kind of organization where the performance would start out with this sort of improvisational technique of starting with base instinctual improvisation that would then segue into the text of the play. And if you recall, there was a discussion about how there was difficulty felt by the actors about how to transition from actions into words. And then they get into this interesting sort of actor-like discussion about how they should try to develop exercises in which they can try to improvise words that might be appropriate for their transition from the base instinctual portion into the text of the play, Aeschylus, Prometheus Bound. So I thought that was a very interesting exchange because it shows not only, once again, the kind of impenetrable actorliness, if you will, of the actor's method and how it can be very difficult for someone outside of that, like myself, to understand. But also it does show this notion of communication and words, and how words are linked to action, or perhaps the difficulty in linking actions to words or instincts to words. And and so it shows like the importance of trying to connect, but also the difficulty or perhaps the impossibility of that connection. And I think that paradox is really at the heart of many things that hopefully we can see later in Act 1, Noli Me Tangere, as the episodes progress. But I think that's a really fascinating concept that's already expressed at the outset here. Okay, so just taking a step back here. So we have, as I mentioned at the outset, I think 4 main character components in this first episode already. And I've spoken briefly about 2 of those components, the first and the second acting troops, so Lili and Thomas. And based on the title of this episode, De Lili à Thomas, one would think that this would probably be it, right? Because we have Lili of the first part of the title, and we have Thomas of the second part of the title. But the characters don't end there, right? Because we have another character that appears. And this is the character who is played by Jean-Pierre Léaud. And he is credited as being un jeune sourd muet, which means a youth that is deaf and mute. So this is a very interesting character, right? We see this character with long hair, quite dashing, right? And those of us who know French cinema will recognize him immediately. Very famous, very, very famous. But we see him in this thing of going into cafes and giving these notes, right? messages of fate, and basically asking for money. And we see another one of the ways in which he tries to get money, which is he plays his harmonica in a very annoying manner, and he will go away once he is paid. And he does this, we see at least with, he goes into 2 separate cafes, and so we see his interaction with these people there. And we also see him in his room later during the sequence with the Prometheus Bound troupe. It's very interesting because, as you remember, in the Prometheus Bound sequence of the episode, we see intercut with that, I think 3 times, 3 separate occasions, shots of this Jean-Pierre Léaud character in his room sitting cross-legged in a very interesting pose, almost like a Buddha-like pose. And we see him in 2 of those moments, we see him, 2 out of the 3 moments, we see him stamping a pile of blue paper, which we understand to be these things that he is giving out, these messages, right, of fate. I'll give you a message of fate if you give me $1 of some money, right? So he seems to be stamping these messages out. And then this is intercut, as I said, with the scenes of the actors on the floor writhing and moaning and groaning with the acting troupe of Thomas. But we also see him pulling a book, which I understand is called La Banlieue. And we see him ripping out randomly, or seemingly randomly, a stack of pages from the middle, and then ripping those out page by page, and then folding them and inserting them into these envelopes, which we assume will then be the envelopes that he will give out. So we understand, therefore, that based on the credits and based on what's being printed on these blue envelopes that he's giving to these people seemingly at random, he is deaf and mute. And he is doing this in a way to try to get some money. But the way that we see him, or we revert back to him randomly, or seemingly randomly, interspliced with the acting troupe scenes, I think is very interesting and very peculiar. And we should remember this. Now, why are these 2 sequences that seem to be without any relation intercut in this way? And that is a very interesting question that I would like to save for another occasion. But let's just stop right here and just think about what we can try to make of this based on the information that we are given within the context of this premiere episode. Okay, so we understand based on the credits and based on the information that's presented on the blue envelopes that this young man is, or he, well, how should I put it? It is stated in the end credits that he is a youth that is deaf and mute. We never see him speak, too. Even when he's by himself, we never see him mouth a word. So there's nothing in the first episode that suggests that he can speak. And so perhaps that means that the label that is placed upon his character at the end credits could be true. We don't have anything in the episode to show us anything to the contrary, right? Although there is something very interesting. The way, remember the timing, just recall the timing of the way in which we go, we are looking at Thomas' Prometheus Bound troupe. Right before we cut to a shot of the youth, the Jean-Pierre Léaud character in his room sitting cross-legged, stamping the envelopes. This is the moment where we have the character of Achille saying in the very staccato way, don't think that I am silent out of pride or stubbornness. Okay. It's very interesting that then, maybe a couple moments later, we then cut to a shot of the deaf and mute young man. Perhaps there is some kind of signifier or connection there. So perhaps we might think, we shouldn't think that this young man is silent out of pride or stubbornness. Perhaps there is something more to this than meets the eye. And I think there is a subtle hint of something going on with this particular character. We should also say, too, that this character is a little bit annoying. He plays his harmonica in a very annoying way to aggravate on purpose. And so he doesn't necessarily gain our sympathies immediately, although at the same time he's a very famous actor in the context of the French New Wave, and so he is immediately recognizable. So almost from the get-go, we have this sort of contradiction, if you will. We are used to allying our sympathies with him based on his on the actor's reputation in the French New Wave. At the same time, this character seems to be a little bit annoying or aggravating, or there might be something going on with him. And also the way in which his scenes are spliced into the film also seems to create a kind of mystery as to how his storyline is connected with the other storylines. So let's think about that as we progress through this series, Out One Noli Me Tangere. But let's think about the fourth and final major component of this, which is the woman who we see for the first time sitting at a table in a cafe, and she is sitting at a table behind a young man. And this is a remarkable scene because when we first see this young woman sitting behind this young man, and she's facing towards us, and then the young man is also facing towards us. So it seems like he has his back to her and they're facing in the same direction, right? So when we first see this pairing, they don't seem to be related. They're sitting at separate tables. They don't seem to be talking in any way, so they don't seem to know each other. And they're facing the same direction. In other words, they're not facing each other. But when we look, he seems to know that she is watching him or doing something or observing him, but they're still sitting in a way that they are facing the same direction, which is very fascinating. Only much later do we realize that there is a mirror, and in fact he is facing a mirror and she is sitting behind him also facing the same mirror, so he is looking at her through the reflection of the mirror. We don't know this until we get a step back with the camera. And so for the longest time, it almost is like they're looking at something that is the same thing, but then we realize, no, they're not looking at something. In fact, he is looking at her and she is looking at him. It's a really fascinating example of this sort of corridor of mirrors, quite literally, that is taking place, which creates this almost labyrinthine feeling of confusion and complexity, all within this micro moment. It's a really great moment. Now, this woman is played by Juliette Berthaud, and she is credited at the end credits at this particular stage of the proceedings as une jeune voleuse, which means a young thief. And the young man that we see is credited as being un faux célibataire, which means a fake bachelor, a fake single person, right? Because during their conversation, when they begin to talk to each other, he says that he is a single man, but then she asks him, oh, show me your hands. And then she notices a ring, which she assumes to be a wedding ring. So she says, I don't believe you. And so that's why I think he is labeled in the end credits as being un faux célibataire. And she also gives a story, right? She says, I think the assumption by the man is perhaps she is maybe a prostitute, perhaps. But then she seems to catch on to that particular assumption, and she says, I'm not what you think. And she goes into the story about her mother and her brother and how she's an artist. And so we get these glimpses of something about her, but we also get something a little bit double-sided to her nature, right? Because when he gives her money for cigarettes, because she says, I'm out of cigarettes, she then leaves the place on the assumption that she will buy cigarettes, but in fact she leaves the cafe altogether. And we see her then, a couple sequences later, we see her descending some steps and then reascending the steps, leaving the cafe. And then some sequences later, we see her ascending some steps all the way up to what we assume to be her apartment with the money. So therein lies the reason why she is credited as being une jeune voleuse in the end credits. So she's not given a name quite yet. but we will get to know her very soon. So she, like the young man, the Jean-Pierre Léaud character, they seem to be on the outskirts of society in the sense that both seem to be trying to use certain underhanded means of getting money, and perhaps that might make them be not necessarily the most sympathetic characters in this episode, at least. They are certainly the characters we spend the least amount of time relative to the earlier acting troupes of Lili on the one hand with Seven Against Thebes, and Thomas on the other hand with Prometheus Bound, in particular with Thomas and Prometheus Bound. But please note that we will see these characters again. And oh boy, there is a way in which this episode closes, and I'll try to get to that in a second with respect to not only Lili, but also with the Une Jeune Voleuse character, the Juliette Berthaud character. Okay, so that is in a nutshell the breakdown of the episode in terms of these characters. So what to make of Out 1, Noli Me Tangere, episode 1, premier episode, De Lili à Thomas? First, let's try to keep these characters straight, in our heads as best as we can. I know that there are a lot of characters, and I know that there's already a lot of confusion. And how are these people connected to each other? What's the point? And I know that there's a lot of confusion here, but I think this will play itself out with more clarity. At least I hope so, as the episodes progress. But anyway, let's just, for the time being, try to keep clear in our heads who is who, and let's rely on whatever it is we can, maybe online resources or this book, and let's see if we can just try to keep them clear in our minds as the stories progress. But for now, we know that there is, let's see, in the first grouping there's Lili, there's Marie, Elaine, there's Quentin, and there is Nicolas, Arsene, Theo, and Papa, right? So there are those 5. And then for the second grouping, we have Thomas, we have Achille, we have Beatrice, we have Bergamotte, Rose, and Faune. So the 6. And then we have the young man, who is the deaf and mute man. And then we have the young thief. And we have the peripheral characters as well. The last character that's credited is the fake single man, the fake bachelor. But these are the main characters that I think we should think about and remember as we leave this episode and go to the next episode. What are some other things that we can try to take away from this as we progress? I would say let's think about the little details that seem to be emerging. You know, one of the things that is really great about Out 1 is that it is, if anything, it has a huge sort of cult following. People who are really into this know all of the details, every single detail. You can go online and do a very simple search, and you'll find almost immediately sites that are devoted, for instance, to all the locations that are used for Out 1. Now, I am not an expert in Paris, so I don't know. I've been to Paris only once in my life, and so I don't know Paris as well enough to appreciate the sights that we see in Out 1, although I do get a sense, generally speaking, of a kind of geography. But then again, I am not in any way an expert in Paris. So if that's interesting to you, I would suggest trying to find sites online, doing your research, or for those of you who know Paris, relying on your own direct knowledge of the city to try to get a sense of where these characters are. And we will get a better sense of this as the series progresses. But for now, let's just recall these certain scenes. And let me just point out here as well, this is going to be very important, in particular when we talk about the final episode, episode 8. Just remember that first cafe that the Jean-Pierre Léaud character walks into when he does his thing with the card. So just remember that first cafe, and because that's something that I want to talk about again when we reach episode 8, because it's actually very, very interesting. So just remember that cafe, the first one that he walks into, because I think in this episode we see him walking into 2 cafes, but I'm talking about the first cafe. So just remember that. And also, there's also some playful banter with respect to numbers. And I want you to keep this in mind as well. There are, I think, at least 2 instances where there are talks about numbers. And these happen sort of later in the episode. They both happen in the Lili acting troupe storyline. So there's the thing where they're talking about, so Lili goes and she's off to the back somewhere, and Quentin mentions, oh, there's Lili going off with her daily phone call again. And who is she talking to? There's already a kind of mystery that's developing. So who is Lili talking to on the phone every day? Who is Max? Is she talking to Max? What is going on with her? Why is she making these phone calls every day? I mean, her actions seem pretty innocent at this moment, but there is a sense of a kind of mystery, or just an interest as to why she is doing what it is she's doing. And I think that mystery is further elongated, if you will, not to a great extent, but just to an interesting enough way when she emerges from the curtains, as it were, and she goes to who she would call Nicolas, and she says, "Do you know Monsieur Furstenberg?" And she's asking about this person named Mr. Furstenberg. Is he short and fat with glasses or something like that? And she's asking if Nicolas has seen him. And Nicolas, because something to do with a bookstore, and Nicolas opines that perhaps Mr. Furstenberg, is he the one who has the 13 volumes of the Wagner prose? Okay, 13. This is a number that I think will become quite significant later on. But please remember this. So we have a mentioning of the 13 volumes of the prose of Wagner. So 13. Mr. Furstenberg, who is he? What's going on? What is this? Again, we're not sure by the end of the episode, but perhaps this is significant. But at the very least, my friends, remember this number 13. The idea of numbers also plays out again in a sequence that directly follows when the troupe, the same acting troupe, is saying, "What are we going to do now?" The trembling chorus, and they're saying, "What page is it on?" With the text, is it page 89 or 88? Is it page 87? Or no, it's page 72 or something. So they don't quite know what page the text that they're going to use is on. So there's a little interesting play on numbers there. And in fact, there is also a game that one can play when one thinks about the kind of numbering that might be going on. And in fact, is there some kind of significance with numbers in this particular universe of Act One? And this really, the more one thinks about it, the more one realizes that there are certain ways in which rhythms and numberings seem to be playing themselves out both explicitly and implicitly. Just to give you another example, and perhaps something that's probably a little bit more implicit, count the number of times that we see the Jean-Pierre Léo character stamp his thing. How many times is he stamping? How many times do we see him folding a piece of paper from the book La Banlieue and putting it in an envelope? How many times do we see these sorts of things? How many characters are there? Right, there is for the Lili group, there is 2, 3, that's 5, and then we have in the Thomas group, that's 6, I think. So 5 plus 6 is 11, and then if we count the 2 other main characters that we see, the Jean-Pierre Léo character and the Juliette Berthaud character, that's 6 plus 5 is 11, plus 1 is 12, plus 1 is 13. Oh gosh, 13. So and how long is the work out one? It's almost 13 hours, etc. So we can play this game. The more we think about it, the more I think fun it can become, of this idea of exactly what's going on with all these numbers, and how are these numbers playing themselves out in this very interesting, almost web-like way. And perhaps this will become more obvious and more prevalent as the episodes progress. But let's just keep that in mind, my friends, as we finish this premiere episode. So let's see, to end or to begin to wind down this conversation, what can we say to conclude our first discussion of Out One Noli Me Tangere? We end with certain shots that I would say are probably suggestive or kernels or hints or clues of perhaps something bigger to come. And I mentioned Lili and her telephone call, and this reference to Mr. Furstenberg, and also earlier references to Max, what's going on. There is a kind of impenetrability with respect to what she is doing and with respect to what Thomas is doing. Also, let's recall, what is the role of this young man, and also what is the role of the young woman who we see at the very end of the episode before we cut to black, pulling, what does she pull out of her bag? A gun. Is it a real gun? Is it a fake gun? I'm not sure, but it is a gun. And we see her putting it down there as she's sitting there, seemingly contemplative, thinking about what? Something. Who knows? I don't know. And then we cut to black. And that's the end of the first episode of Out One Noli Me Tangere. There is so much here. Again, the more one watches it, hopefully one can get into all these intricacies and details. If you've seen it for the first time, perhaps it's hard to get into. And again, there is a whole huge following to this, and there are people who know the ins and outs of this work much better than I. But to get a clear sense of this, or a clearer sense of this, if you have the opportunity to see this episode again, try to catch as many of the little details as you can. You know, the color of certain clothing, the way in which certain characters are acting, maybe in sync or out of sync. I mentioned Marie at the very outset. When you see the episode again, look at Marie and see how she is slightly out of sync with the rest of the characters, and maybe that has something to do with what she might end up doing later in the episodes. Who knows? Look at all the little details, like when Thomas and his group are talking after they've done their performance. Look at the in the background there, you can see an album, Western Memories. Wow. And you can see on the background too, a chalkboard with some musical notation symbols. And there's something in the back too with like a drawing. I think it's a pig's behind or something like that. So there are all these little symbols, or they could be clues, they could be just nonsense, who knows? But there seems to be this suggestion of a semblance of a something or other that might be suggestive of a larger thing, a mystery or conspiracy or something going on. But there are all these little things that one can try to pick up if one is interested, of course. And again, there is a huge following that is devoted to this series that just goes at every single detail of the frame. So if you are coming at this for the first time, and if this interests you or excites you, then I encourage you, my dear friends, to re-examine this episode at your earliest convenience and try to pick up all these details. There are so many, much more than I can get into with this very simple, very general level video that I make on YouTube. But I can appreciate this world that has been developed around the greatness and the largesse that is Out One Noli Me Tangere. So it's my pleasure to try to share with you at least my own very general, very simplistic ideas as to this, at least in the context of a discussion between you and me in the YouTube forum. So there is that. So, okay, my friends, let's just begin to wind down our discussion here. Do you have any thoughts or comments about this first episode of Out One Noli Me Tangere? If so, I'd love to hear what it is you have to say in the comment section below. This is something that is worth discussing. This is something that is a really great, grand piece of art, and so the more discussion, the merrier. My hope, though, and let's please try to keep our discussion spoiler-free as possible. If you're going to mention details of any future episodes, I just ask, please just put a little spoiler tag in your comment, just in case there are people out there who haven't seen Out One and want to review the comments before progressing with the other episodes, of course. So that's just my only request to you, is to label any spoiler discussion with a spoiler tag or something, just so other people can avoid it if they want to. So, my dear friends, that is it for now. So next time, let us discuss Out One Noli Me Tangere Episode 2, Deuxième episode, and hopefully I will see you there. In the meantime, my friends, I hope you are happy and healthy and well, and that you continue to watch a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, cheers.